Thank you very much. I want to begin by giving my thanks to the Kenyon Institute for arranging this trip. I've been living and doing research in many parts of the world, but I've never before yesterday come to this part of the world. It's a great pleasure to be here. And my thanks also to Professor Nache for hosting us at Hebron. So this is my subject. I want to talk about the costs of income and wealth inequality, the costs as distinct from the benefits, and especially the costs for democracy. I begin with two epigraphs. This first one from 1520, Niccolò Machiavelli, who said, "When only the powerful propose laws, not for the common liberty, but to augment their own power," that is, the powerful propose laws to increase their own power, then the state is corrupted and its foundations are undermined. That was 1520, and 400 years later, the celebrated Supreme Court judge in the United States, Louis Brandeis, said more or less the same thing. That is, we must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. We cannot have wealth concentration and democracy. We have one or the other. These are my two epigraphs that frame my talk. I want to begin by giving you just an overview of what has been happening to income inequality in the OECD countries. Between the mid-1980s and 2010, income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient increased in all OECD countries, that is, all countries that were members of the OECD in the mid-80s, except one, which is Greece. Greece had the collapse just before 2010, and maybe that collapse was explains why Greece did not have an increase in inequality. So I'm going to be talking about the OECD countries more than developing countries. And the point of this is that in all of the advanced industrialized countries, income inequality has been going up, and in many going up by quite a lot. So if you take the OECD countries today, which include Israel, which include Chile and Mexico, then this is the sort of rank order of regions of OECD countries in terms of inequality. The most unequal countries, in terms of the Gini coefficient, are Mexico and Chile, that is the Latinos, and the Middle East, namely Israel. They're the most unequal. Then come the Anglo countries, that is the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Then the European Mediterraneans, that's Italy, France, Spain, Portugal. Then the Northwest Europeans, that is Germany, Scandinavia, Belgium, and so on, Holland. And then at the bottom, the least unequal are the East Central Europeans coming out of a background of communism. So that's the rank order. The most unequal are the Latinos and Israel, followed by the Anglos. Economists, that's the first point. The second point is that economists have long ignored the whole issue of income inequality. When I say IN, that means inequality. They've long ignored the whole issue, and here are some quotations from celebrated economists saying that income inequality is not a problem. This is Martin Feldstein, professor of economics at Harvard, one of the most well-known of American economists, saying in 1998, income inequality is not a problem in need of remedy. That is, we don't need to do anything to reduce income inequality. This is Robert Lucas, also professor of economics at Harvard, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. Of all the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive and the most poisonous is to focus on questions of distribution. And this is Willem Buiter, who's now the chief economist of Citigroup, and he was my colleague at LSE. He left LSE and multiplied his salary about 10 times when he went to Citigroup. And he said, "Poverty bothers me, inequality does not, I just don't care." So there's a question of why economists have ignored inequality for so long, even though it's been increasing everywhere. And this is one part of the explanation. The explanation is that economists have a standard explanation for why inequality has increased. They say inequality has increased because of technological change. Technological change is skill intensive. Therefore, technology change increases the premium, the rewards to skills, and that increases inequality. The people who don't have the skills become relatively poorer. And that explanation has an important implication, which is that the rise in inequality is simply apolitical. It's got nothing to do with policies or with politics. It's just natural. It's just a byproduct of a system which is raising income levels for everybody, and therefore anybody who worries about inequality is just being envious, just expressing envy. They don't realize that income inequality is necessary for generating increases in income for everybody. That's the standard economics line. The fatal flaw in this whole way of thinking is that when economists say some inequality is necessary and desirable for incentives, and that is true, they imply that there's no upper limit to inequality, that the more inequality is always better. The more inequality always gives more incentives, and therefore it's always better. And that implication is simply wrong, because what they are doing is to ignore the costs to a whole society of levels of income inequality. So that's the second point. Economists have long ignored the whole issue of inequality. The third point, the World Bank, which is very influential in setting the whole development agenda, has also long ignored income inequality. For example, the flagship reports of the World Bank are the World Development Reports. Each year the bank publishes a World Development Report. And in 2005, a group of people in the bank wanted to write the next World Development Report on inequality and development. So they sent a proposal to the board of the bank, which governs the bank, and the board said, no, you cannot write about inequality. The reason is that inequality is a political concept, and we, the World Bank, are a non-political organization. So we can talk about opportunities, because opportunities are not political, but income inequality is political. And so the group of people went back and they redrafted their proposal, and they said, we're just going to talk about opportunities and development, and we will call opportunities equity. And so that is, increasing opportunities means increasing equity. And so the board then said, all right, opportunities, that's non-political, and so you can write about opportunities, but you can't write about inequality. And so this World Development Report 2006 was called Equity and Development. And of course, if you read it, it's full of information about inequality, but they can't acknowledge that, because inequality is apparently political. So they have to keep pretending that they're just talking about opportunities. Very strange. Here's another case. I see I've misspelt this. I put a C in there. The G20, the summits of the G20 also ignore inequality. For example, the summit of the G20 in St. Petersburg just a couple of months ago produced a communique of 12,000 words, and this 12,000 words made no mention of income inequality. it made only one mention of income distribution. So the G20 is very concerned to ignore the issue of income inequality. However, there has recently been some concern with rising inequality. Such, for example, the World Bank has recently issued reports on income distribution, despite what the board said in 2005. So there has been a change in the World Bank. And the IMF has even started to identify rising income inequality as a problem that needs to be addressed. So that's rather shocking. Here's another example. The World Economic Forum publishes a global risk report, and in the global risk 2012 report, it asked respondents around the world that is experts around the world, to rank various kinds of economic, environmental, geopolitical, technological risks, to rank them according to what would happen over the next 10 years, and to rank them according to their likelihood, the probability, and also the impact if they happen. And so if you combine the two scores of likelihood and impact, then the greatest risk to the whole world, according to these respondents, comes from chronic fiscal imbalances. But the second greatest risk comes from two things together, namely severe income disparity and water supply crises. So this is another example of how just very recently experts have begun to worry about income inequality, especially income concentration at the top. And so that raises the question of why. What has happened recently? Well, one thing that's happened recently is that suddenly new data has become available, especially for the United States, on what is happening to the top 1%, that is, to the share in national income of the top 1%. This information was really not available previously, and the information has been produced by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saïs, French. And so suddenly there is information that really shows how dramatically the top 1% has been lifting off from everybody else, from the bottom 99%. And it's quite clear that an explanation for increasing inequality, like technological change, the skill bias of technological change, that is, university graduates get more income than high school graduates, that explanation cannot explain why the top 1% has been doing so much better than everybody else. And it's clear that the reason why the top 1% is doing so much better is not to do with technological change or international trade or any of these other things. It's to do with policies and politics. Somehow a set of people have managed to manipulate policies and politics so that income is being channeled up to them in unprecedentedly large amounts. And I'll just show you the pattern for the United States. So this diagram shows the percentage of national income going to the top 1%, including realized capital gains. This blue line includes realized capital gains from 1913 through to 2006. And so you can see the broad pattern, the U-shaped curve. For much of the 20th century, this is the peak. In 1929, the share of the top 1% reached almost 23%. I mean, just think about that for a moment. The top 1% was accruing 23% of US national income. That's how unequal it was. And then came 1929, the crash, the Depression, the Second World War, the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and the share of the top 1% went down, down, down to 9% by the late 1970s. And then came the Reagan and the Thatcher neoliberal revolution, and policies and politics changed radically in favor of the top 1%, and so the share of the top 1% went shooting up from 1980 to reach by 2006 the same as in 1929. And the reason for this great crash and this great slump that we are living through is quite closely related to this run-up in income concentration at the top, just like the crash in 1929 was related to this increase through the 1920s in the share of the top 1%. This is another measure of much the same thing, but it shows the share of the increase, not the share of the total, but the share of the increase in national income accruing to the top 1%. So through the 1990s, as US income increased, the share of that increase going to the top 1% was 45%. 45% of the increase went to the top 1%. Through the Bush years, 65% of the increase went to the top 1%. And through the Obama years, that is 2009 to 12, this figure is absolutely incredible. Given that this is a stably functioning democracy rather than a military dictatorship, this is absolutely amazing that there could be that degree of income concentration. Here's another measure of much the same kind of thing. It's the ratio of the remuneration of CEOs to the median annual wage. So for the US CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies, their average annual remuneration relative to the median wage was 324. They were paid more than 300 times the median wage. In the UK, the FTSE 100 average CEO salary is nearly 200 times. So the British CEOs do very badly compared to their American counterparts. But look at the poor Germans. The German CEOs have only 90 times the median wage. But that is an indication of how much a very small section of the population has lifted off from everybody else. And just to show you a couple of other cases, this is New Zealand, another Anglo country, and this goes from 1984 through to 2011. This line here is the median, so it's 50% down, household income, so it's completely flat over that long period, 1984 to 2012. This is the income of the top 1%. So again, you can see how huge are the gaps between the median. And this is Iceland, a country where I have done a lot of research, except this is the US, the share of the top 1% in the US, just for comparison. Iceland had a great Big Bang neoliberal revolution in the late 1990s, and you can see that the share of the top 1% in Iceland went shooting up from about 5% right up to near the American total of 20%, and then came the Icelandic crash in 2008, and it plunged back down. But it's still 8.5%. The top 1% in Iceland is still getting 8.5% of national income rather than 20%. So this increase in inequality at the top was quite widely spread, but not everywhere. As I said, northwestern European countries did not have anything like the kind of increase in inequality that the Anglo countries had. And this shows Scandinavia over a long period of time. This is the share of the top 1%, and just look at 1980, 5%, and then it more or less remained constant, except for Norway. This is Norway. I don't know what happened in Norway, but anyway, if you look at this for Germany, if you look at it for France, you get much the same picture. There's not much increase after 1980 in the share of the top 1%. So what does that mean? It means you can have a prosperous capitalist economy. You can have a prosperous capitalist economy without having the kind of big increase in inequality that you see in the Anglo countries. So this is the conclusion, that during the neoliberal period since the 1980s, the very rich, especially in Latin America and the Anglo countries, have soared ahead of everybody else, including the middle classes, all those professions. Now, there has been some research on the economic costs of inequality, and as I suggested, the rise in inequality over the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s is directly related to the kind of crash that we have had. But actually, I'm not going to dwell on that link. We can talk about it in the discussion afterwards if you wish. I do want to direct your attention to a wonderful film which is both educational and very funny, which is about the relationship between rising income inequality and this financial crash that we're living through. That relationship is brought out in the floor, and you can find this film on Flexlix, whatever it's called. You can find this film, you can download it. I want to say just a little bit about the social and health costs of inequality. A lot of evidence is summarized in a book by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level. Those of you who don't understand the title, you need to know that in British English, the name for the device used by carpenters to determine whether a surface is level is called a spirit level. So you have a bubble in a window, and if the surface is like that, the bubble is on this side. If the surface is like that, the bubble is on that side. If it's level, the bubble is right in the middle, and that's called a spirit level, and so they took that as the name of their book. This book, which summarizes health and social costs, has sold 250,000 copies in 25 languages since it was published in 2009, which gives some indication that there's quite a lot of worry in a general way about rising income inequality. I'll just make 2 points about their evidence. The first one is to give some tangible indication of how income inequality affects whole societies, the shape of whole societies. So this shows average male heights, the average heights of adult males. This is in centimeters, 177 centimeters, 181 centimeters. And this is the Gini index of inequality for recent years. And so you can see dramatic results. You can see the suggestion of a very powerful effect of inequality, namely that countries that have high inequality, such as the US, high inequality, or the UK, have low heights of males and females too, and countries that are more equal, like Sweden, Czech Republic, Norway, Belgium, they have high heights. Look at Denmark here, look at Netherlands. So this is some indication of the sort of pervasive effects of income inequality. And by the way, I'm told that this same relationship applies, but in the opposite direction, for size this way rather than size this way, so that the more unequal countries have a higher rate of obesity than the lower inequality countries. The line goes like that, but it's quite a strong correlation. And the second point I'll make about health and social consequences is the relationship between inequality and social mobility, intergenerational social mobility. And the basic point is that the more unequal the society, remember I'm talking about the OECD countries, the more unequal they are, the lower is intergenerational social mobility. So within the OECD, the highest rates of social mobility are in Scandinavia and in Northwest Europe. and the lowest rates of social mobility are in the United States and in Britain. The United States and Britain are moving from a class society towards a caste society. And the reason for this relationship is clear. The greater the gains from being in the elite, that is, the greater the inequality, the more the elite will fight to ensure that their children stay in the elite rather than drop down. And so that's why you get this relationship. Well, I want to spend a bit more time on this, namely the political effects of income inequality. There is amazingly little research, at least in the Anglo world, about the political effects of income inequality. And I think the reason is that just as economists take as their sort of core model the model of the free market, political scientists take as their core model the median voter model. That is, they say the hypothesis of the median voter model is that governments are most responsive to the preferences of the median voter. That is, democratic governments are responsive to the preferences of the median voter. And if that's the case, then rising inequality does not tend to shift public policy in the direction of the preferences of the wealthy. That's the hypothesis of the median voter model. So what are the political costs? Well, one kind of political cost, I'll mention two, is that income concentration correlates strongly with political polarization or political paralysis. And this is a piece of evidence from the United States. It shows the share of the top 1% in national income, much the same chart as we saw before, the blue chart. This is about 1980, so you see the big run-up after 1980, just as before. The amazing thing is how closely correlated this line is with an index, the red line, an index of political polarization in the US Congress. I won't delay to explain how this index is calculated, but basically the more polarized is the US Congress, the less cooperation there is, and the more difficult it is for the Congress to approve any legislation. And so you can see that as income became more concentrated, so political paralysis increased. And we are seeing this, like the shutdown of the US government just very recently, is related to this very high degree of income concentration in the United States. That's one type of cost of inequality. The second type of cost is this one, and I'll say a bit more about this because this is very dramatic. The second cost of income in concentration is that, as Machiavelli and as Louis Brandeis said, the preferences of the rich increasingly determine public policy as income concentration goes up. And so the first step in this argument is what are the differences in preferences for public policy by income group? That is, in what kind of areas do the preferences of the wealthy differ from those of the middle and the low income groups? And so one recent study published just this year asked a large sample of Americans a number of questions, or it asked them to agree or disagree with a number of propositions. For example, this was one proposition: the legal minimum wage should be high enough to prevent full-time workers from being in poverty. And of the rich, people who had more than an income of $1 million, 40% agree, therefore 60% disagree, and amongst the general public, almost 80% of the public agree. In other words, twice as much as the wealthy. So here's an example of a clear difference in preferences of the wealthy as distinct from everybody else. This is another example. The proposition was the federal government should provide jobs for everyone able and willing to work who cannot find a job in the private sector. And only 8% of the wealthy agree, or over half of the general public agree. This is another example of how the preferences of the wealthy differ from those of the rest of the population. And the preferences of the wealthy differ on a whole range of issues, such as the issue of the minimum wage, on whether capital gains should be taxed, on what is the top economic priority, whether it's to cut the budget deficit or to reduce unemployment, and then the question of how the budget deficit should be cut. Should it be cut by cutting social spending or by raising taxes? On all these things, the preferences of the wealthy differ from those of the rest of the population. So that's the first point. There are these differences. The second point is what determines the preferences of the wealthy. Why do the preferences of the wealthy differ from those of the rest of the population? And here it's useful to draw upon recent research by social psychologists about the consequences of social class. That is, the consequences for behavior of some people having much more money than other people. One of the main psychologists investigating the consequences of social class is Paul Piff at Berkeley. If you type Paul Piff into Google, you can come up with some of his research, Paul Piff. And the basic conclusion from this body of research is that those who are living high on the socioeconomic ladder tend to be less empathetic, that is, more selfish. They tend to regard other people that they encounter as either aids or obstacles to their own ambitions. They relate to everybody in an instrumental way. They do not have much empathy with the situation of other people, and that helps to understand why they don't want the minimum wage, because they don't have any empathy with what it's like to be poor. They want the government to cut the welfare state. And so this research is summarized with the phrase, the money empathy gap. That is, as you have more money than other people, you have a loss of empathy with other people. Here's an example of the money empathy gap. It comes from one of the most powerful politicians in the United States, who said, this is Paul Ryan, "We don't want to turn the safety net into a hammock that lulls able-bodied people to lives of dependency and complacency." Therefore, he was saying we should eliminate the safety net, eliminate the welfare state, because the welfare state only makes people lazy and dependent. And here's the New Zealand Prime Minister saying much the same thing recently. Anyone on a welfare benefit has a lifestyle choice. If one budgets properly on a welfare benefit, one can pay one's bills. This is, again, a lack of empathy. So that's the second point. It's about how the preferences of the wealthy, or why the preferences of the wealthy differ from those of others. The third point is then whose preferences count in terms of public policy. Public policy reflects the preferences of which income group. Remember, political scientists say public policy reflects the preferences of the median voter. Well, this is research by Martin Gilens, 2005, who concluded that when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of poor or middle-class Americans. In other words, government works for the top 1%. That's the kind of bottom line. And as he says, also, representational biases of this magnitude in favor of the wealthy call into question the very democratic character of our society, and you will recognize that this conclusion echoes Louis Brandeis and echoes Machiavelli. So this is the bottom line. Economic policy is made by the top 1% for the top 1%. What about, I've been talking about the United States. What about the UK and Europe? to my amazement, when I have asked my colleagues at LSE about comparable research in the UK and Europe, comparable with the US, they don't know of any such research which shows the extent to which the preferences of the wealthy are determining public policy in Britain and in Europe. They don't know. And I'm not a political scientist, and I keep wondering if political scientists in Britain and Europe are not studying this, what on earth are they studying? This would seem to be such an obvious question. But here's one piece of evidence. It comes about the relationship between affluence and influence. It comes from the OECD countries, and it shows that countries with the largest increases in the shares of the top 1% have seen the largest cuts in top-rate taxes. The largest cuts in top-rate taxes, so that suggests that across all these countries, the preferences of the top 1% who want lower taxes have been very influential. So this is the conclusion from all that I've been saying about the political costs of inequality, that as income concentration increases, the rich make it harder for non-rich to have any voice in how the society is run. That's the bottom line conclusion. This all raises one very interesting and puzzling question, which is, why are the middle classes so politically apathetic in the face of this concentration of income at the top, which is keeping the middle class incomes constant? Why are they so apathetic? Why have they allowed the top 1% to get 95% of the increase in US income between 2009 and 2012? And I'm just going to leave this as a question, because I don't have a good answer to the question of why the middle classes have been so apathetic, so accepting of this enormous concentration of income up at the top. I want to finish by talking about what I think social democrats, or if you will, the center-left, should be pushing for in this kind of situation. Because there is a puzzle. In previous hard times, for example, the Great Depression, but other periods of hard times, the left gained electorally. But since 2008, it is the right wing, the political right, which has gained, not the political left. And that is, I think, very puzzling. And part of the reason is because the center-left, or the mainstream left, has lost its political narrative. It doesn't have a good alternative account of politics compared to that of the right. And so that voters that are angry at unemployment and spending cuts, they're going to the hard left or to the far right. There's this polarization going on, and in the middle, the left is nowhere to be seen. So, what should the left, the mainstream left, be doing? The first thing to do is to reject the way that conservatives have characterized the left as pro-state. That is, the conservatives have said the left always wants to increase public spending. And that's something that the left should reject. They should not present themselves as pro-state. They should present themselves as pro-income and wealth fairness of distribution. That should be the center point. And the reason is because if the left accepts the way conservatives present the left, then it's easy for conservatives to say, we are in favor of freedom, and you, the left, are against freedom. And that tends to be quite effective in an appeal to the electorate, because everybody likes freedom. So that's the first thing. Reject the way conservatives are framing the left as being always in favor of a bigger state. Reject that. Rather, concentrate on income concentration and the cost of income concentration. In particular, focus on what is happening to the top 1% compared to the bottom 99%. And to emphasize that the reasons for this income concentration are not to do with technological change or with international trade. They are to do with politics and with policies. And politics and policies can be changed to make for less income concentration. And so the central task of the left is to highlight how a wide range of institutions, policies, and rules favor the people who are already affluent. This is a key source of this line of argument. Dean Baker's book, The End of Loser Liberalism. And in this book, he shows that many institutions and policies which are justified as being good for economic growth, good for efficiency, are in fact good for concentrating income right up at the top. And so if you want to follow up this argument, that's a good book to use. And so one important implication of all this is that the left should not just talk about improving equality of opportunities, because if there's a highly concentrated distribution of income, then in the next generation the distribution of opportunities to earn income will also be quite restricted. The opportunities will be big for the children of the wealthy, but they will be narrow for the children of the poor. And so the second thing is to emphasize this relationship between income inequality today and limited intergenerational social mobility tomorrow. And so just to bring this together, the key word that the left should be making much more use of is pre-distribution. Pre-distribution is different from redistribution, and the left has focused much too much on redistribution through the state. Redistribution means tax the wealthy and use the money to redistribute to poorer groups. And that is always going to be a difficult tactic for the left to use, to emphasize redistribution, because it allows conservatives to always say, you, the left, you favor the failures, the people who are not successful. You are penalizing the people who are successful by taxing them and giving to those who are less successful. And that, again, is an argument that appeals to Western electorates. So pre-distribution refers to the determinants of market income distribution before taxes and spending. And the question then is, why shift to the determinants of market income distribution before tax and spending? The first reason is because market income distribution is the main determinant of disposable income distribution. So if you want to make disposable income distribution after taxes and benefits more equal, then you have to change the distribution of market incomes before taxation. And so the bottom line of all that is the left should be talking much more about, focusing much more on how a whole array of institutions, policies, rules channel income up to the top before taxes and spending. That's what the left should be giving much more attention to. And just two more quick headings of what the left should be doing, giving more attention to. The left should be presenting big finance as a problem rather than as a solution. Whereas economists say that finance lubricates the economy like oil lubricates an engine, and therefore more finance is always better. That is simply not true. In Britain, for example, the financial sector in Britain is lending 4 times as much to the property and the financial asset markets, 4 times as much as it is lending for the production of goods and services. So the whole financial sector is sort of lending to itself and yet the financial sector is driving British politics. And then the very final point I'll make is that the left should be giving much more attention than it has to political finance reform in order to reduce the influence of big donors, the influence of people in the top 1% in shaping public policy. An example of the problems of dealing with political finance reform comes from the UK Commission on Standards in Public Life. This commission produced a report called Political Party Finance, Ending the Big Donor Culture. This report was a big, glossy report which was launched with much celebration at Westminster in November 2011, and it died on the night that it was launched. That is, nothing more was heard of this report because neither the Conservative Party, nor the Labour Party, nor the Liberal Democrats wants to touch this issue of political finance reform because they all depend on big donors. And so nothing more has happened, and therefore the influence of big donors continues. I've been talking about ideas, that is, how the left needs to change its ideas with which it appeals to the electorate. But there's a separate question, which I'm not going to talk about, but I want to mention this separate question, which is how to organize political support. And I'll make just one point. If the elite, if the top 1% is monolithic, and if it has a unified vision, then there's little prospect of the left ever getting political power or the left ever changing the agenda in the way that I've suggested. There's little prospect. But the fact is the elite is not unified, and the left has to appeal to segments of the wealthy. And so then this strategy that I've been talking about has to be complemented by sort of bottom-up initiatives. I've been talking about top-down initiatives, but also there are bottom-up initiatives like expanding the scope for cooperatives would be one kind of example. Okay, and here I've listed a number of references. I'll leave this PowerPoint with the department, and you can follow up these references at your leisure. My bottom line is that we in the West and you here should be giving much more attention than has been given to the problem, to the costs of rising income concentration up at the top. Thank you.
Thank you.